You mentioned a little bit before about the other sort of like the vaccine hesitancy and how you use the same sort of research to kind of figure out what motivates people with vaccine hesitancy and even Asian hatred. Can you maybe explain the methodology a little bit in a way that your everyday guy can understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, with any form of disinformation, what we always do is we begin with open source intelligence collection. And what that
Mhm.
means is we actually go through social media platforms to understand, what are these certain hashtags that are used when talking about very specific topics, or what is the general social media chatter when it comes to this issue. So, for this is really when I came across like certain ethnic slurs that were used against the Hindu community, is when I actually began to do some open source intelligence collection on Twitter, where I found very openly genocidal memes that were targeted specifically at Hindus and where certain ethnic slurs would be in use. So, for example, the slur Pajit that we came across in our research, that's really where it came about. We when we found these memes openly calling for violence, calling for a repeat of 2611, or extreme violence against Hindus, this was always associated with this slur Pajit. And so when we took a look further, where exactly does this slur come from? We found that it actually has origins in 4chan, which is a very fringe, like extremist community where all of these like very, very fringe elements have operated. Unfortunately, in our times, there's been a lot of violent events that have taken place, and all of them do have sources that go back into 4chan in some way or another. And so then we actually began quantitatively taking a look at this data to see, what is exactly the usage of these anti-Hindu slurs on 4chan? What are the dimensions of it? And that's when we actually realized that in 2022, anti-Hindu disinformation has been at an all-time high on 4chan, on Gab, where several mass shooters have actually posted their messaging, and Telegram, where white supremacist communities have often been messaging and organizing together. So this came as an immediate concern because the safety and security of the Hindu community and all communities truly do matter. And repeatedly, we've seen spillover effects into the real world.
Sure. And
Oh,
Parth, would you? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. No
no,
problem.
sorry. I was going to say I was also missed out like the natural language processing side of things. So when we
Yes.
came across this certain like ethnic slur, we also performed natural language processing techniques using word to vec and also graph analyses to better understand how terms like relate to one another. And so when we took a look at this anti-Hindu slur and performed our graph analyses, we were actually able to see the dimensionality of anti-Hindu hatred. And several of the clusters that we found actually share a lot of similarities between anti-Asian hate, anti-Semitism, and also Islamophobia. So we see how these extremist communities basically borrow off hateful tropes from several other communities and direct them towards the Hindu community.
See, I find that very interesting. So, so you're talking about how other groups also use the very same language, the same tropes, and it's kind of so. For example, there's radical Islamists, there's the extreme right wing white supremacists. These guys on in any other scenario they would be enemies. You know what I mean? So how is it that they find common ground in Hindu hatred? Like that's what brings them together in a weird way. Do you have maybe any insight on that?
So I haven't specifically looked at the interaction between like white supremacist and Islamist communities when it comes
Mhm.
to anti-Hindu hate, but one thing I will say is that this anti-Hindu slur of Pajit, which is used in context of 4chan, and also certain Islamist communities have been picking up on that on Twitter, where that, for example, that meme of calling to repeat what happened to George Floyd and saying, "Oh,
Yeah.
we're going to do this to the Hindus," and using these very fringe Pepe the Frog memes, that's
Yeah.
actually borrowed straight from the white supremacists. So these two communities are borrowing hateful tropes from each other. And there's actually this paper called, I think, The Accelerationist Movement, the link between white supremacists and Salafi jihadists. It's a paper published several few months ago from King's College London. Which I find very interesting. It definitely did talk in more depth about how these two different groups, the far right, like neo-fascists, and the Islamists, basically borrow off several tropes from each other.
Wow.
Just to build
Parth,
off of what Prasiddha was saying as well, I think Abhishek, it is facially surprising that you would see groups that have such different
mhm.
interests globally converge on this, but there is an interest convergence, right? In the sense that both white supremacists as well as Islamists have an incentive to spread disinformation about Hindus. Their geopolitical goals, their political aims may be different. They may occur in different geographies, but at the end of the day, they both fundamentally have this common hatred of Hindus. And so in that sense, it's not surprising that they use similar tropes and similar language when they're discussing the Hindu community. In fact, you do see also with respect to the Jewish community, very different groups using the similar language as far as spreading anti-Semitism, right? So you see anti-Semitism on the extreme left, and you also see the same language being used as well on the right. So in some sense, this interest convergence is something that we see with respect to other religious communities as well.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.